There it is. Go live. All right. I think we are live now. Hi.
Woohoo.
Well, welcome everyone back to another What the Frac live. We are your fractional executives, where we go over marketing trends, tips, maybe some hot topics and some unpopular opinions in 1 hour or less. I'm just going to start saying 1 hour or less, Tamara, because we never stick to 20 minutes.
20 minutes is so hard, especially with the topics and like the case studies that we've been talking about. So yeah, we try to be those people who can be short, but I could rather like do a documentary than a tweet. So that is where we're at.
There you go. Today, I'm so excited about our guest who's already here. You can see his face right there. And normally, Max, you are behind the mic. You are not in front of the camera, but we're talking about podcasting, starting, growing your podcast. I get a lot of small businesses who come to me and say things like, oh, my marketing's not really working, but I'm going to start a podcast, right? And to me, that's like having a baby to save the marriage. Podcasting it's hard. Podcasting is hard, but if you do the right things, or you're using it to collect the right content, it could be really beneficial to your business. So I'm just really excited to have Max here. I was on your podcast, the Wild Business Growth Podcast. We had such a good conversation. We had all the dad jokes. And I just knew as soon as we were doing these lives, we had to have you on. So thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Well, really appreciate it, Nicole and Tamara. And I think if podcasts are babies, then I've had a lot of babies. I have a podcast myself, as you know very well. But on the day-to-day, I help produce and edit and launch podcasts for what's now become dozens and dozens of entrepreneurs out there. So lots of babies. So here we are, and we're already corny making baby jokes a minute in. So thank you for that.
I didn't warn Tamara at all on this. So.
No.
This is like, you need a full disclaimer. I was listening back to the interview Nicole did on Wild Business Growth, and it was some of the best dad jokes I've ever heard, and always good to have a refresher there. So everyone be warned.
Oh, ouch. Okay. Well,
ouch. Ouch is the only appropriate response.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do we start? I mean, there's so much for this podcast episode. Most of our viewers are small business owners, medium-sized business owners, startups, or they are actual marketers, fractional executives, directors of marketing. And most of them are thinking through, like, how do I market my company? How do I build a strategy? Where does podcasting fit into that?
So I agree with what you said first of like, if you're going to launch a podcast just to like save your business or just to have a podcast, like that's definitely not the right way to go about it. Like you should, and I was just in a strategy session earlier today with a new client. I always like to think through, like with any new podcast, like what are the goals? Like, why are you starting this? Like, what do you want to actually achieve? So it's the same thing with like any form of marketing ever, like any tactic that you use ever. It's like, you don't want to just, what's the term? Throw spaghetti at the wall and see how it sticks. Like there has to be some intention behind it. So I think if you're a small business owner, if you're a fractional executive, if you're considering podcasting, I think before you do anything, think through like, all right, well, does it make sense for us to have a podcast? What do we actually want to achieve with it? And then you can start getting through like, all right, what does this podcast actually look and sound like, and how many babies are the right amount of babies for our business?
Yeah, I think that's really
where that's going.
That's what like that question. What do I want to achieve with it is really important, because I think all too often when I hear people start to talk about they want to start a podcast, there seems to be like a little bit of it, maybe a lot of it, because they're not getting enough press coverage or enough, ways to engage with their customers, and they think the podcast is an answer, when really a podcast is a full-time job. So adding that into kind of your marketing stack may not be the best idea. when you're talking with business owners who are thinking about doing this and you're like, what are your objectives? What do you really hone in on? Because like, how do you get them to realize, how do you either get them to realize or find that special niche that they should podcast about? Because it can't just be, a random, we're going to throw up a podcast and get 1,000 followers by, next week. So how do you hone in and get them to that like real aha of what their podcast should be?
Yeah, aha is a wonderful term. That's an aha moment in itself. And I think when you think about goals, you want to think about, you're going through the decisions that are actually going to shape like what the podcast is actually going to look like. So by going through the goals and thinking like why podcasts make sense for your business, that's actually shaping like what the podcast name is going to be, what the artwork is going to be, what the like description summary paragraph on the platforms is going to be. So when I'm talking through goals with clients, I'm really trying to zero in on, all right, is this a podcast that you're going to use in more of like a networking way, and that you want to connect with other influential people in the industry? For example, like having Nicole Zeno on your podcast, like that would be really cool. You never know what that can turn into. No, but so like if you're in it for the networking standpoint and like building out your networking community that way, then it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, it makes great sense to have an interview podcast then. If you are looking at podcasting from like a thought leadership and credibility kind of, or even a branding play, then it kind of can lend itself to doing a solo podcast or even interview podcast, but like there's different topics that are focused on like those areas that you have that expertise in. So like there's the networking route, there's that thought leadership route. So it's important to, just those slight distinctions right there, you can kind of start to see how like, oh, this actually changed what the direction of what a podcast actually might look like, what the format might look like. But I think in addition to that, yes, I agree with that. In addition to that, I think it's really important to think through like, picture your business, your brand with the podcast, and then picture what it would look like without one. And when you think of it with the podcast, like what is that podcast actually going to add? What's it going to do for you? And there's, we could talk, there's like endless benefits of doing a podcast, but what really is going to be like that difference that it is going to create? Like what more value are you creating as part of that? And then you can really drill down deeper, starting off hot with alliteration, to really dig into those moments again with like, what's our hook here?
Yeah. Sorry about that, guys. It's
Oh,
alive,
no.
right?
Oh, you're good.
That
I thought that was you at first, and I was like, wait, that is not Nicole.
It's very likely that my son will barge in at any time as well. So we're
yeah. We all know this. Our community knows this. So, so Tamara, I think you have something to say here, and then I have something to jump in too with. So go for it.
Well, so one of the questions that I always have, especially for podcasters, is how long did it take you to get from 0 followers to 100 followers? Because I think that's really a kind of a pivotal jump, right? And very hard. So now I've got 2 questions for you. How long does that normally take? And then kind of coupled with that, when starting out, how many hours of work do like small business owners usually need to put into a podcast to get it started up and going and kind of continue it?
Yeah.
Can you tell as a journalist? I've got more questions. Let's do it.
Let's go. Are you providing free water and beverages as well? No, but you're gonna hate this answer because it's the classic like it depends, because and the reason is that I've worked with a wide variety of podcasts, and podcasts, like anything in terms of downloads, followers, your audience, anything like that varies so much, because you could be, for example, like we work with a sailing magazine on the West Coast called Latitude 38. And what worked really well for them, like they started to get a pretty big following early on, because in addition to the podcast, like they have this magazine, like print magazine, that goes back to 1977, and they've got tens of thousands of subscribers to that. So if you're like coming from like the publishing world, or like have a magazine, or have like, a trillion, I don't think anybody's there yet, but we're pretty close to like the first trillion followed person. That's very futuristic. If you have a huge audience already, then like first episode or even like a trailer episode, like you might have a huge audience there. Whereas for most people, if you're starting from scratch there, like it's going to take you some episodes. It's going to take you the fact that you need to do that consistently. So I don't have like a specific time frame in mind, but in terms of how many hours you put in, podcasting, as you said, takes a ton of time. I mean, that's the insight behind like why I started Max Podcasting in the first place. Like when I was doing my podcast in the early days, I realized like, wow, podcasting is a ton of fun. I want to keep doing this. I want to keep building this. Like there's lots of perks to it, but it like can completely sweep up all your time if you're not careful about it. So like that's where Max Podcasting came from, was like, how can we take that time off of other small business owners' plates and like give them that high quality podcast they deserve, but they're not doing like all those minuscule things that takes, all that time behind the scenes. So one of the common misconceptions about podcasts is like, if people haven't launched one and they're a fan of podcasts, like they've listened to some episodes, you might think like, oh, this is just, 2 or 3 people that take 30 minutes to record something and then boom, publish it. Yeah. But actually like the most time consuming aspect of anything, it's largely the editing. So the actual editing of your podcast, whether that's audio or video or both, as well as the marketing. And like marketing is becoming more and more time consuming because there's more and more interest in like video clips and like endless clips that you can use on TikTok and Reels. And, we can go down that wonderful rabbit hole there. But like the editing and the marketing takes so much time, and that's not even considering like the planning leading up to it. So like you definitely need to carve out at least a few hours a week. And then if you're like working with somebody like us, like you can, you can limit your time a week to kind of like whatever marketing you're doing yourself and the actual recording. But like it's still going to take multiple hours a week kind of any way you slice it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the points that you just made, is that the marketing's hard, right? So one of the things that people think is like, okay, I'm going to put out a podcast and it's going to be like YouTube, where it's a search engine and people are going to find me through that podcast. And like, that's such a big misconception, because if you have a community, then a podcast is a great way to reach them, to engage with them, to make them feel very part of your community and up to date. But if you're using it to build a community, that's going to be extremely hard. There's no one like search engine where you're kind of putting your podcast. Now, Spotify helps a little bit. Putting it out on YouTube helps. What I like to say is, if you're a fractional or you're a marketing director and you're thinking through podcasts as a way to build your marketing, you can do it. For instance, me, I like to get on camera. I can start talking about a topic. It's much easier for me than trying to think through writing a blog post, right? It takes a lot more time for me to write a blog post. I'm less comfortable to go out there. So if we use the podcast to break it down into, TikToks and Instagram Reels and YouTube videos, right? And now we take the content in that video and build it into a blog. And I'm not going into it as the podcast is going to save, or I'm going to make money off my podcast in the first 30 days. Then there's a plan there, right? There's a plan on how we're using that podcast. If you are going into it just saying, I'm going to make money off this podcast, there's plenty of ways to do that, but it's going to take time. And it's going to take a lot of effort, and you need to have all those pieces. And I was just telling you how Tamara and I, the first time we decided on what the Frac, like it took us, Tamara, months. How many times did we re-record the first episode before we were happy with it?
Yeah, and it still hasn't even come out yet.
We're living in the future here. Yeah, what the Frac have you guys been doing?
Yeah. I do love the name.
Yeah.
But what Nicole just brought up was like really, really, I actually think insightful, because and especially for small business owners, right, who are crunched for time. Here you think about starting up a podcast, and we're saying podcast actually takes a lot of work. So if you're doing it for the reason of just staying in touch with your community and making your marketing simpler, because it's the most streamlined way that you can take your information and break it up out into tangible bites for your community, that's super smart. If you're utilizing, in my opinion, if you're utilizing a podcast as like a brand new way to market to people, then you are like doubling down on all the work that you need to do to market. And it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
I think a piece that both your comments made me think of that I think helps to kind of reframe how people think about podcasting is, often people, they launch a podcast and they'll people, what a wonderful way to describe it. People, it's just people. The people do podcasts, but they get going and have the consistency down. They're releasing once a week or once every other week, and they're good with that. And then eventually, inevitably, everybody, even if you get to a level that is like way more than you initially thought, like everybody at some point is like, man, I wish I had more listeners, or I thought I had more listeners now, or something like that. And I use the analogy, like, one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to is the Tim Ferriss show. Like, I love Tim Ferriss. Like I just think he's one of the best interviewers ever and has amazing guests. And he paid me to say that. No, I'm just kidding. But I think he's approaching like 1 billion downloads, which is hard to even like wrap your mind around, like sit there and count to 1 billion. But like, I'm sure Tim Ferriss wishes he had more listeners. There's no end to that. It's just like a natural human thing to like want to grow more, or like being like, man, I wish this was bigger. But I think with podcasting, something that's so powerful is the fact that they are so powerful. Like when you are listening to a podcast, you like feel like a connection, and I'm not getting like woo woo, I mean like high level. You feel like a connection with that host. It feels like you're sitting there in the room, or like a fly on the wall for that conversation. Like it is an intimate form of either education or storytelling, depending on the podcast, that I haven't seen in any other form of content out there. And so like, obviously the medium has evolved, and like there's more and more video as part of it, and people are like, oh, well, what's a podcast? What's a video show? What's a video podcast? It's like that line continues to blur. But especially when you think about like what I call old school traditional podcasting, like audio only podcasting, like that's still my favorite way to consume podcasts. Is like, I'll be at the gym or doing the dishes or like cleaning or like out for a run or something. And the fact that you can listen and learn and be entertained and hear you can hear whatever story you want from whoever you want at any time you want. And it's like, it's literally in your head. Like that part is still mind blowing to me. And that part is still like such a powerful insight that I think makes it such a unique medium. So yeah. I think the way you flip that and kind of from the brand standpoint, or if you're a small business owner, is like, okay, if I have the ability to get in the ears, which sounds terribly wrong, get in the ears of my audience and, have a direct message where people are going to be like engaged, and like I'm literally in their heads, like what message or like what sort of value or entertainment or story is like, what do you want to tell?
Yeah. And we know this as marketers. We've seen a lot of data around how podcasters, influencers, right? Like the line is blurred there, and how podcasters actually can sell at a higher trust rate and at a quicker ROI sales cycle than almost anyone else out there on the internet. And it's mainly because you get that, you start building trust, you get that intimate relationship with your listeners. And it's almost like going to, old school, going to your neighbor and saying, hey, I need a roofing company. Who have you used? Right. Or I need a plumber. Right. I want to take these vitamins. Right. You kind of start going to your group, and people feel connected to podcasters because hearing a voice, hearing that knowledge, being with them every week, there is that intimate connection. So if you can build the community, it could be very fruitful for your business. But once again, when we're talking about building a marketing plan that's actually going to work, does the amount of time spent in it, does that correlate to ROI, right? And I think that what you have to think about, there's ways to do podcasting and see a different ROI, right? So not just revenue numbers, right? And we'll go in, I have a big question about revenue from you there, Max, but revenue is not the only KPI here, right? If we're talking about getting out to new communities or new eyes, right? Getting new people into our community. Having an interview podcast might be a really great way, because now, Max, you're on our live today. all of your people who follow you have probably now seen that you're on our live, right? And so now we're bringing new people to our community. Hopefully we say something valuable to them. Next week we'll have another guest, right? And that can actually help. So if your KPI is bringing new eyes to your brand, or bringing new leads to your brand, right? There's ways to do that. And then there's also ways of being on other people's podcast or using other people's platform and time and work and money to kind of supplement those pieces. So podcasting is not just about being the host, having your own one. There's definitely ways and I guess my question to you too is, if I wanted to be on more podcasts, but I don't want to start a podcast myself, maybe I don't have a topic, I'm not comfortable yet, I want to practice, how do I go about doing that?
Yeah, podcast guesting, as the cool kids call it, is like becoming a more and more spot of interest for people, because it's like, who doesn't like to be on podcasts? Who doesn't like to be interviewed? I mean, I hate this right now. You guys are awful, but like, in addition to that, it's fun to be interviewed. It's fun to chat to people. It's fun also to, like, afterwards you have like, that's a cool thing or a cool feature that you have that you can add to your website. You can share out with, your followers, your community. Like, there's a lot of perks of being on it. And if, like, depending on how big the podcast is, or if it's the right audience, like, you never know, like, what leads it can create for your business, or what intro it might make for you or your personal brand. So I think it's a thing that's kind of like a no-brainer. Anybody should strive for, like, see what you can do to get on more podcasts. I mean, there's always hosts looking for more guests. Like, there's always hosts looking for more guests, and there's always guests looking to be on more podcasts. So it's like a mutually beneficial thing going on there. But I think more tactically, if you are interested in being on specific shows, I would do your research, like, listen to an episode or two of the show to make sure you fully, understand it, and, like, know what they talk about, and make sure you're a good fit. But also, check out their website, check out their socials, see what the best way to contact them is. And then, I mean, I'm sure you guys get this for your show as well, but, like, anybody who hosts a show starts to get, like, spam requests all the time of, sometimes they're really good, sometimes they're legitimate good guest pitch requests. And then other times it's like, wow, this person clearly sent an email out to 100,000 people and just said hi, and there was nothing specific about my show or about me or anything. Or like I keep getting an email about some interview that I did on some HR podcasts, and I have never been on an HR podcast. Like, I don't know. I've gotten 25 emails about this podcast. I don't know what, and they're like, Max, we really loved you on that. That was the other Max Branstetter. But, like,
I had a podcast project that I did called Mind the Ceiling. And it was purely for women leaders who had, broke glass ceilings in their industry, right? Like, very specific. And I kept getting LinkedIn emails from men who wanted to be on my podcast. And I was just like, ugh. Like, just read it. Just look at the artwork.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Shout out Joe Polizzi, Robert Rose, This Old Marketing. We've done some work with them, and they always talk about frequently in their episodes how like they don't have guests at all, except for special, like, live in person at conferences, recordings that they do. And they get guest pitches all the time, even though that they don't have guests. It's like, you got to do your research. But anyway, so that's one subset of, like, all right, find the shows that you want to be on, listen to them or watch them, and then find the best way to approach them and make it a good pitch where the host knows that you actually care and are thoughtful about it. So that's one thing. And the other aspect, and this is, like, a growing part, over this past decade especially, like, there are more and more companies and podcast booking agencies and, like, companies that are solely built to place guests on podcasts and vice versa. So, like, shout out Alex Sanfilippo. I always say that wrong. From Podmatch. So, like, that's a common one. I've had some really, really good pitches and good guests from Kitcaster is another good company. Like, there's a lot of really good ones out there. Like, there's too many to just, like, list off all of them. But if you're somebody who, like, is willing to shell out a little bit of a budget, I have no idea what the costs are for those. But if you're somebody who's willing to shell out a little bit of of marketing spend or podcast marketing spend to be like, hey, maybe I'll just let somebody else find podcasts for me to be on. Like that's a great route to go as well, because there's endless amount of podcast hosts on those sites as well.
So
How
Max,
often have you had to be like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to ask him, you talk a lot about all these things. What's your unpopular opinion about podcasts?
My unpopular opinion about podcasts. That is a great point. I think, okay, so I think right now this is unpopular, but because there's so much interest in video. And granted, I'm saying this on a video show, so kick me off. But my favorite part of podcasting is still the tried and true, like, audio side of podcasting. Like, that is, in terms of how I actually listen personally, and like the fact that, as I was, ranting on for 47 minutes before about how you can be doing something else and be benefiting from like listening to that. I think that and that on-demand magic is still like my favorite part of it. Now, I love video, and from a production standpoint, it's fascinating to see, because like we're helping lots of podcasts out with video and video clips now as well. And most of the new clients when I started Max Podcasting back in 2020 were like all audio and weren't even considered being a video podcast. And now it's almost completely switched, where it's like it's way more common for new clients to be like all video and audio, as opposed to just audio. Even the ones that are, just kind of audio thinking, want to record with video on and have video clips as well. So I think, obviously long-term audio and video are both going to be big, but I think the audio side of podcasting has like way more staying power and way more benefit than it gets a lot of credit for recently, because video, obviously, I mean, literally adds another dimension and possibilities, but there's something about that old schowold audio magic that about podcasting that I always love.
Yeah, you have to.
Tamara,
I was saying, you two are very, and now I'm in this as well, but you two are very good at interrupting each other at the exact same time and then cutting each other off at the exact same time.
We're normally not. We're actually pretty good at this, but today we're just off.
Yeah, I think that's because I have to jump in like 2 minutes. So I was just going to say my last little thing, which jumping off of what you were saying, because I'm the same way. I really like the audio part of podcasting, but I enjoy the video part for the social clips, right? I do like to scroll through and then just see that one-off take from someone via like video versus the audio. Cause I mean, there's just something about that for the social media, quick, dopamine hit that you get. Otherwise I only listen to my podcast. Like I don't want to sit and watch my hour and a half long political debate.
Right. Yeah. Watching is much more effort. And now you can still not watch every second, and you can have it off to the side, but then it's like, oh, what if you miss something while video? So yeah, it's a completely different dynamic, but there's obviously room for both of those. And even I'll go out on a limb and say live streaming is pretty cool as well. Might be biased here in a second, but
yeah. Well, and I mean, if you think about it, like live streaming is the part that is the marketer part of the podcast, like trio of things, right? We're talking about, right? You have the actual show itself and the content. You have how people are going to view, listen, or watch it. And then you have how are you going to market it, right? And there's really kind of these 3 pillars to podcasting. And if we even want to say 4 pillars, how are you going to monetize it, right?
We're adding pillars left and right.
We're adding pillars left and right. But
Just
how are you going to monetize it too, right? And so those 4 things you have to think about when you're thinking about a podcast. It's not just, hey, I have a great voice, and me and my friend, we are really funny when we talk about things together. Let's start a podcast. And you can do that if there's no goals to it, right? But if you're going to have goals set around business, ROI, things like that, you have to think about how are you recording, like what's the content, how are you presenting it, how are you marketing it, and then how are you monetizing it. And monetization doesn't have to be pure money coming straight from the podcast. It could be leads coming in that then turn to money in your business, or a product, right? We talked about Girls Gotta Eat and their Vibes Only company, and like completely not money coming from their podcast, but it also is money coming from their podcast, right? Like they're using that community. And the other thing I want to say to what you just said is that if you're intimidated by video, if you're intimidated by audio, if you're intimidated by each of these pieces, this is where you find what works for you. If you're intimidated by video, podcasting might be really great for you to get your expertise out there, because you don't have to worry about your hair being done, and you don't have to worry about looking at yourself in the video, and you can build your confidence. And maybe you have to actually also record that 5 times to build your confidence, right? So if you're thinking about a podcast, you're thinking about getting your expertise out there, try it. Just start. You don't have to release it. You can record it. We use SteamYard or StreamYard. There's other ones out.
SteamYard sounds
SteamYard.
like a naval boat yard.
Yeah, we use StreamYard, Riverside. I mean, there's all these products out there. You can even just turn on your camera and record and just start and see what you feel most comfortable. And some of the most successful podcasts didn't have video until recently. So there's no reason you can't be successful without that video piece.
Exactly. And there's like huge podcasts that have crazy big audiences and will remain that way or keep growing that are audio only as well. So like there's a lot. Yeah. There's room for everything in that. But I totally agree with your point. Like, it takes a while to get over get out of your comfort zone with anything. And I think podcasting is a fantastic way to, like any form of getting your message out there, like you have to test and learn and see where you excel at and where you're able to go. And sometimes it might take years before you're able to like take that next jump. But it's, we've never had more tools and also like cheaper tools at our disposal to go ahead and do that. So shout out SteamYard and all the naval ships and everything there.
Yeah. So I want to go into revenue and how do you build revenue with a podcast and how do you grow it? But I know, Tamara, you have to unfortunately leave us. So we'll stay on, but
I see how it is, Tamara.
I know. Sorry, the East Coast kids hour here. But I'm going to miss the best part. So I'm going to be listening to this live. So please give me all of the tips that you have for going from zero revenue to any sort of paycheck, right? Like, I think that's what everyone wants to know. So thank you for being a guest. I'm going to be out. I can't wait to keep listening.
Perfect. Thank you.
So Max, how do I have a podcast. I have a ton of content. I'm doing all the marketing stuff. Like, how do I start making revenue?
Yeah, that is super easy. You release one episode, it goes viral, and you also win the lottery at the same time. So it's like that, that's kind of the blueprint there. No,
my pet peeve is people saying going viral is their marketing plan. So you just hit on that. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And then now this is going viral as we speak. How about that? We're all over Be Real in MySpace right now. But I think this is another like really good like myth of podcasting where it's very common to assume that like it's easier to monetize than it is. And there's a caveat here, but I think when I look at monetization, there's like 2 wings. So like if you're at the SteamYard, there's 2 big boats here. I'm never gonna let you let that one down. No, this is the beauty of live. No, but there's like what I call direct monetization, and then there's indirect monetization. So like direct monetization is like what you think of like when you listen to podcasts and they have what's called a mid-roll ad in the middle of that. Like they're shouting out a company in the middle of that. That company or that brand is paying them to be included and like read out as an ad on their show. So it could be mid-roll, pre-roll, post-roll, all these words that I can't even pronounce. There's lots of ways to do that. You could have a presenting sponsor where it's incorporated into, you shout them out at the start of every episode and it's in the podcast artwork. Like there's lots of ways to do that. So like that's direct monetization. I think with that, you're in a really cool opportunity. Well, first of all, I think anybody can find sponsors no matter how big their audience is. Like there's no rule that says you need to be this big in order to have sponsors. There are like unwritten or maybe written industry rules that like there's standards of how many downloads per episode if you're gonna, you know, throw your podcast out there and hope to get like the biggest sponsors out, you know, the companies that are like the huge brands that advertise on podcast. Like some of those brands only want to advertise on the biggest podcasts out there. You're also you're in a unique position at the start if you can get like a sponsor on board when you're launching and saying like, hey, would you want to be like one of our first sponsors for the show? And you can include them like in your launch and in the materials there. And like when those episodes at the start have like extra attention, or it's like your first big splash, then they're included in that. So that's pretty cool as well. But I think the reality with direct monetization is like, it's far more difficult than people let it on to be. And also if you have, you know, with sponsorship there, like it's probably going to be, well, especially if you go off the industry standards, like you're going to be paid way less for that part of it than you would think. What I prefer, and I think is far more common and far more feasible, is like indirect monetization, meaning like think of the podcast as a way to like help you drive in more revenue by like a number of different ways. So and maybe this is something that you're going to ask about, but like I'm like an interesting case study with Wild Business Growth, because like right now, like I'm a media partner for CEX, Content Entrepreneur Expo. So like I'm giving them shout outs in the middle of the episode. But like I'm not making direct money from the podcast, and like I've been doing it for, you know, almost 300 episodes now. So people are just like gonna, you know, jaws drop on the floor, like, whoa, like what are you doing? But also like from the beginning, like I didn't launch the podcast and say like, one of the main things I want to do with this is monetize that. Like I don't care about monetizing the podcast. Like if the right partner comes around and it's like a really good fit, then like I'll consider it. But also I know as a listener, like I'm very turned off when a podcast has lots and lots of ads. So like there's a fine line there. However, I look at all the ways that the podcast has driven revenue for me indirectly, and my entire income, my entire business, like would not exist had I not started the podcast in the first place. So like I'm also a unique case because I'm in the podcast production space. Like literally I'm in that space. So like makes sense for, you know, obviously it all ties together with the podcast. But I think overall, think through what ways can you drive back to your business, or what ways can you create more leads or create more connections through your podcast, where that might end up with people, you know, working with you or working with your business. And the podcast had a role in helping that, or maybe they heard it in an episode, maybe they reached out to you after. But that sort of thing I think is far more common and far like easier, especially in the early days, than like, hey, we're gonna land ESPN to sponsor our sports podcast, and here's a mid-roll ad from ESPN. So there's kind of the two routes there, but I'm a big fan of building building that indirect monetization around the podcast. And the podcast, you know, it doesn't hurt to have content every single week in your expertise.
No, and I think you like completely hit on it, is that, you know, if you're for marketers talking right now, the podcast is essentially a lead magnet, just like a ebook, right? Just like any of this content we put out there, the podcast should be a lead magnet, making sure that the topics are, you know, your buyers, you know, what they want to listen to, what their challenges are, what they want to talk about, you know. And even if you're going to bring on sponsors, you know that they're the right sponsors for the buyers that you're talking to or your audience, right? You know your KPIs, you know all of the data that is going on, so that, I mean, you probably analyze your data and, you know, which episodes are doing better, which ones have people who would listen to longer, right? All of those pieces.
People really didn't like the jokes in episode 266 with Nicole Zeno. I don't know what that was. There was we got canceled for that.
You really are prepared for this.
I listen to it every morning, so just figures.
But yeah, I mean, you have to like think through it as a lead magnet. And once again, if you want sponsorship to be part of that revenue stream, look at a lot of these companies that are doing podcasts. They have people who are just on the team who are just dealing with sponsorship.
Yeah.
So like if you don't want to build that team, then sponsorship probably shouldn't be part of that revenue stream, right? And so there's just a lot of ways to go about this. And once again, it comes back to strategy, right? Making sure you're clear on your why, making sure you're clear on your KPIs, making sure you're clear on all those pieces, and then building the strategy and saying no to everything that's not kind of fitting into what you're going for. I love that you use your podcast to basically bring leads to your business. And it also allows you to kind of stay like passionate about it and not feel like it has to fit into a mold that, only sells, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I love that analogy of like, it's like a living, breathing lead magnet, but it adding to that, like it's as if a lead magnet was just incredible interviews with like some of the most interesting people in the world. Like, it's like you have a really cool opportunity to, as a listener, it's be a fly on the wall for really interesting or inspiring conversations that might unlock that to you. And if a person or brand is providing that to you, then it's going to improve your perception of that host or the brand behind it. There's that trust. You used that word trust earlier, which is like, I think a perfect word. Like when we think about like our best friends in life, like our best friends are those that we go way back with and like we have the most trust with. And I think there's that same sort of, in a microcosm, which I don't think I've ever used that word, in a microcosm, it's that same sort of sentiment with podcasts of like, all right, I really like what this person is saying or who they're interviewing. Like I trust this person. Like there's that sort of bond, and trust can turn into a lot of things from a business standpoint or referral standpoint, or just even if it's just from an entertainment standpoint, it can be a really powerful thing.
Yeah. And I think that also another KPI to this is like, if maybe you start your podcast because you really want to become a better speaker, or you want to be really practice and hone your skills around messaging and communicating. There's lots of, I always talk about, people ask about burnout all the time. Like, how do you not burn out from your business? And I always say, like, find a hobby outside of your business that has like practices the skills that you need in your business, but also is not you just working 24/7 on your business. Right. And so like, for me, I started ultra running, and there's lots of things like goal setting and, mental strength and things that you have to have in ultra running that has helped me in my business, right? Podcasting, if you want to learn how to communicate better, learn how to message better, learn how to talk to people better, like, get more confident in front of the camera or in front of talking or answering questions that you weren't prepared for, right? Like these are all skills that are needed in business. So if it's a way for you to practice those skills, that's another benefit to starting it. I don't want everyone to think that we're just like, hey, don't start a podcast, right? Because there's lots of benefits there. So I know we can talk about this all day, and maybe if you guys have other questions or comments, let us know. Tamara and I are releasing a revenue streams troubleshooting episode for What the Frac here as well. So there's some more information there. So watch that. Also reach out to Max. But Max, I want to know, last thing that I want to know, what is your 3 biggest considerations that if someone's thinking about starting or growing their podcast, they're thinking about putting it in their 3-year marketing plan, what are the 3 things they should consider on whether or not they should do it or not?
Really, really good. And I practiced counting this morning as well. So I got the 3 as I'm thinking of the answers by talking. So I think one big consideration is that you should have the correct person hosting it. And I think obviously that means that's more relevant to larger organizations, larger teams, but the person hosting the podcast is extremely important to the quality and ultimately success of the podcast. So it doesn't mean it has to be the CEO or it has to be the founder. It's like it's nice when it works out that way, but also think through who is someone that and maybe it's a team of multiple people and you alternate or you rotate, which works great as well. But like, who's the person or people that kind of has the gift of gab. They can joke around, they can lead conversations, but also they can stay focused on, all right, what are the main things we're trying to get out of this interview or this episode, and then finally what they want to, are they able to commit the time every week to working on the podcast, because that's a huge consideration as well. So okay, number one, know your people. Like, make sure you pick the right podcast host. Next part is to make sure that you are only creating a podcast about something that energizes you to talk about. If I wasn't energized by talking to, creative, inspiring entrepreneurs, or as they say, wild entrepreneurs like yourself, like I wouldn't still be doing the Wild Business Growth podcast. So like always find, make sure that you're picking a topic that, one, of course, resonates with your goals and your brand and whatever reason you're starting the podcast in the first place. But make sure it's a topic that you're really excited to speak into the mic about, or you're really excited to interview people about, because everybody gets somewhat burned out at some point, and you need something to be like, all right, let's add something new to the show. Let's get back at it. And people quit podcasting really easily when they're like, wait, I don't even care about this topic. So that's something to get right from the beginning. And then finally, the other aspect is quality. And this is another pet peeve of mine as well. Quality, whether you consider that audio quality, video quality, both, has never been more important. Like we're through TikTok and Instagram Reels and everything, like we're constantly like we're seeing what feels like millions and millions of video clips every day on social media. And for people to actually pay attention for more than a few seconds and actually tune in to like a 45-minute or hour-long interview, like the quality, like the audio, the video, like that quality has to be top notch. So it starts with your mic. It starts with making sure you're in a quiet place, making sure your dog doesn't bark. No, I'm just kidding. I had to throw that one in there.
Ha!
Thanks.
Thanks.
No, that's the beauty of live stream. No, but like making sure that you have great internet connection. We could talk forever about the right equipment to use there, but if your quality isn't good, and also there's horror stories. That's a dangerous word to mess up. There's some podcasts that are like painful to listen to. Like literally the ads are 10 times as loud as the rest of the episode, or it's like super inconsistent. Like whatever quality you have in your podcasts, that's going to be a direct reflection back on your brand. So you obviously want to have high quality brand. You want a high quality podcast as well.
Yeah, I think that one thing we always tell people is like, if the quality of the content is really good, meaning there's value in the content, to just start. I think that there have been studies, though, that show that the quality of sound, whether it's a video clip or a podcast, is way more important than even the visuals. Meaning, like, if you don't have an editor who can do motion graphics, like, don't just not put it out because there's no motion graphics or there's not the fancy like words popping up and things like that. Now there's software out there that can help you with that now, but the quality of the sound. So if you're going to do one thing, get a really great mic and maybe start the podcast as just an audio podcast, right? And then move into, when you can afford a better camera or whatnot, then move into the visuals. And then when you can afford an editor or a motion graphics person, then move into the motion graphics, right? So there's ways to do it, but I think I've heard studies that sound is way more important than even visuals.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what's wonderful these days, like this mic, for example, is like basically the same model, different iteration, but same model that I started with, ATR 2100X. Like this mic kind of fluctuates between 65 and 85 bucks, depending on the time and supply and demand and all those economic factors. So like you can, and there's plenty other out there as well. Like even if you're somebody with a bigger budget and you want to shell out, a few $100 on a mic, like you don't need to go more than a few hundred. You don't even need to go more than 100 to have really good sound. And you're right. There's something about sound that, I by no means am I a biologist or neuroscientist, because I don't even know which one is right for this, but there's something on like an innate natural chameleon brain, it's neuroscientist level, that like sound just speaks to us when it's really good quality.
I think
Literally
we just
speaks to us.
connect to it too, right? Like you just connect to it. I mean, and you just said that about I had this Yeti mic that literally I've had for
Yeah.
years and years and years, and I'm clearly traveling. This is not my normal background, and I was able to throw it in my bag and at least say, okay, I have good mic. You know what I mean? I have good sound, and it's as easy as that. And I think these Yeti mics are like $125, right? So yeah, sound is just so super important. Well, anyway, Max, I waited till we got really passionate, really into podcasting really quickly. So I did not give you a chance to give us your dad joke of the day. So you said you came with them.
Wow.
What do you got
I
for
did.
me?
Well, none of them are going to be as good as the ones you said on Wild Business Growth. So as a little teaser, anybody who hasn't listened to that episode 266, towards the end of it, Nicole, I'm still floored. Some would even say I'm still like a scarecrow. But here's one that I've used since going this freshman year of college, where I had business presentations class. What do you call a fish without an eye?
What did it just be?
Fish.
Tell me.
FSH. That's awful.
All right. I'll give you
That's-
one. It's really not as good as, I don't know if I could top the one in our podcast. So once again, everyone needs to go listen.
Well, there's
I'll
like
link
3 or
it.
4 in there. Yeah, it's a lot.
I know the scarecrow one, though, is the best one. So we've been talking about trust today. So why shouldn't you trust trees?
Oh God, go for it.
They seem shady. Just saying.
That's good. You are on a roll. Not to throw some shade on you, but you are on a roll.
Well, anyway, guys, there's so much more we can talk about with podcasting. I'm sure we'll have Max back on, but if you have any questions or comments, leave them below so we can answer them. And yeah, as for next week, same time, same day, Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and go watch Wild Business Growth Podcast. Go listen. How else can they get in touch with you?
We are starting to put full episodes on YouTube as well. So, well, appreciate that. The so long story short with me, maxpodcasting.com. That's home base for everything. That's the business. You can find the Wild Business Growth Podcast there. Sign up for the Max. I messed it up. Sign up for the this is the beauty of live. Sign up for the Podcasting to the Max newsletter. That is at maxpodcasting.com/newsletter. It is where podcasting meets entrepreneurship and terrible jokes, as you've seen executed in these last 4 minutes. And for those video versions that we mentioned, we're putting more and more on there. Shout out my guy Jeff, he rocks. That's at YouTube at Max Branstetter, which, as you know, Nicole, and you recite every morning, BRANSTETTER. So
exactly, it's my vocal warm-ups. Is I recite that.
Perfect.
And we didn't even talk about.
Really
there you go. That'll be the new DUI test, right? But anyway,
I was like, I had no idea where that was going.
I don't know where it's going either. But we didn't even talk about starting an email list, so that'll have to be the topic you come back on. How do we monetize with an email list? So, but everyone go sign up. We'll see you guys next week, and thanks for joining us.
Of course. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Tamara. This was great, and I apologize in post.